The city at night, Adelaide, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, looks almost like a postcard if you stand in the right place. The tram lines curve, streetlights hum, pubs spill out their last patrons. But if you walk a little farther, past the neat hedges and the tidy lawns, there are places that don't make it into the brochures. Laneways where someone might be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Quiet stretches of parkland where no one wants to be after dark. And then, one morning, a body is found. A young man, alone, vulnerable, taken from whatever life he was building. Another body appears weeks later, and then another. It isn't random. There are whispers, a group, a ring, the family. People say things in the shadows because saying them out loud might be dangerous, or because the police don't want to hear, or because no one would believe them. So the city keeps walking, and the questions keep gathering. Who were the men and boys who disappeared and were killed? Who, if anyone, protected the perpetrators? Why did a quiet city become the scene of repeated, brutal assaults that felt coordinated? This is still unanswered. I'm Claire Hewson. I'm a former Adelaide journalist and the host of this series. This podcast looks at cases that remain, sometimes painfully, unfinished. In this episode, the Adelaide family murders. We will talk about victims whose lives were cut short, about the investigations that followed, and about the one man who was convicted in connection with these crimes. We will also talk about why, even now, so many questions remain. A quick word about how we'll do that tonight. There will be no music or dramatic sound design. There will be voices, facts, pauses, and, at times, uncomfortable silences. We will be careful. We will not glorify violence or indulge in lurid detail. We will, however, be blunt where bluntness is necessary, because the families deserve clarity, and because a respectful examination requires honesty. Some of what we'll talk about may be distressing. If you need to step away at any point, please do. Joining me is Dr. Marcus Ellery. Marcus is a criminologist and legal academic in Melbourne who has written about Australian cold cases and policing culture in the 1970s and 80s. Marcus, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Claire. It's good to be here.
Let's start with the basics here. What people need to know before we get into the weeds. The family murders is the name given to a series of murders and disappearances of adolescent boys and young men in Adelaide across a span of years, primarily late 1970s to mid-1980s. The crimes were distinctive in their brutality and in how, over time, patterns emerged that led investigators, journalists, and members of the public to suspect there was not just one attacker, but potentially a group, or at least multiple offenders operating with some coordination. One man, Bevan Spencer von Einem, was convicted in the 1980s for his part in one of these killings and is the only person ever convicted in connection to what people call the family murders. But the case remains far from closed.
Right. That's the essential framing. And it's important to stress right up front that when we talk about the family, we're dealing with a mix of established findings, credible witness statements, and a lot of unresolved or contested material. So one of the tasks tonight is to separate those strands as carefully as possible.
Okay, let's set the scene properly. Marcus, describe Adelaide in that era, culturally and socially, because I want listeners to understand how context matters here.
Adelaide in the 1970s and early 80s presented on the surface as a steady, conservative Australian city. Population smaller than Sydney or Melbourne, strong institutional presences, universities, hospitals, churches, and a civic pride in being orderly. But beneath that surface, there were social currents that mattered to how these crimes unfolded and how they were handled. First, attitudes to homosexuality. This was a period where societal stigma was pronounced. Homosexual acts between men had only recently been decriminalized in many jurisdictions, and public attitudes were often hostile or dismissive. That stigma affected victims, some of whom were gay or perceived as gay, and it shaped the way police, media, and families thought about disappearance reports. Second, the way adolescent males who were vulnerable runaways, itinerant workers, or young people estranged from family were treated. They didn't always receive the same urgency from authorities as other missing people might have. And third, policing culture. Like many police forces at that time, there were institutional blind spots. Less developed forensic methods, weaker protocols for investigating patterns, and, in some places, a reluctance to connect disparate reports unless someone forced the issue.
So, stigma, vulnerability, and institutional limitations. Those are the threads we need to hold on to as we move through the stories of the victims. Speaking of which, the easiest way to lose sight of what this is really about is to speak only about the pattern or the theories. We must always come back to the people who were killed. In this section, I'll tell, as respectfully as possible, what is publicly known about the victims associated with what's called the family murders. I won't use names unless they're already widely reported, and I will try to keep the focus on who they were, not only on how they died. The victims were mostly adolescent boys and young men, teenagers and men in their early 20s. Many were alone at the times they went missing, walking home from a night out, hitchhiking, or leaving venues. Some had contact with older men in the days before they vanished. Families describe sons and brothers who liked music, who had friends, who were trying to find their way. Parents' statements, which are in the public record in various inquiries, are heartbreaking. Pleas for information. Expressions of bafflement that a life could be taken with such finality, and frustration at unanswered questions. Where bodies were recovered, there were often signs indicating that these were not random acts of violence. Some victims had been restrained. Some showed injuries that suggested prolonged assault. Some were left in places that seemed selected, remote, or symbolic. Those kinds of details, when they recur, create patterns in investigative work.
I'll add, many of the public statements from families emphasize two things that are vital but sometimes overlooked in sensational coverage. One is the ordinary humanity of these young men, their hopes, ordinary routines, and relationships. The other is how many of those left behind feel they never got a full accounting from authorities. That sense is as important to the story of the case as the forensic facts.
Exactly. Let's talk about the patterns investigators noticed, what people mean when they say modus operandi.
When investigators initially and then retrospectively looked across the cases linked to the family murders, several repeating features emerged. Victim profile. Mostly adolescent or young adult males, often alone, sometimes known to frequent particular areas at night. Abduction features. Accounts and some physical findings suggested victims were controlled, restrained, or incapacitated prior to being killed. There were indications, in some cases, that the offenders had knowledge beyond a typical street attacker, medical-style restraints, specific ligatures, or an ability to move bodies to secluded locations without being observed. Another pattern was the level of cruelty and the staging. Some crime scenes suggested prolonged violence, and in a few instances, bodies were disposed of in ways that implied planning. That raises a fundamental investigative question. Are we looking at a single sadistic offender operating repeatedly, or a network of offenders who shared techniques, locations, and perhaps the same social circles? The evidence points more strongly toward multiple perpetrators, or at least assistants, because of the logistics involved in moving victims and in committing violence with a low profile. But, and this is crucial, the existence of patterns doesn't prove an organized conspiracy. It raises a plausible and serious concern. The evidence points more strongly toward multiple perpetrators, or at least assistants, because of the logistics involved in moving victims and in committing violence with a low profile. But, and this is crucial, the existence of patterns doesn't prove an organized conspiracy. It raises a plausible and serious concern.
Now we need to talk about Bevan Spencer von Einem. Marcus, take us through who he is in relation to this series of murders and what the conviction did and didn't establish.
Bevan von Einem is the only person ever convicted in connection with what the public calls the family murders. He was prosecuted and convicted in the 1980s for his role in the murder of one of the victims associated with the wider set of crimes. The prosecution's case, in essence, was that von Einem participated in the abduction, restraint, and killing of that young man. There was physical evidence introduced at trial, as well as witness testimony that linked him to the crime. That conviction answered one vital question: that, at least in one instance, an individual, von Einem, was responsible and had acted in a way the court judged criminal beyond reasonable doubt. But the conviction did not close the broader series of murders. It didn't identify, in court, a full network of accomplices, or confirm that every other killing attributed to the family was carried out by von Einem or his known associates. So while the conviction provided an important measure of accountability, it also left many gaps.
Listeners will hear, in trial records and press coverage, that prosecutors advanced a theory of von Einem as part of a circle of men who exploited and abused young males. But as you just said, Marcus, what a jury found in one trial is not the same as resolving a complex pattern that may involve others, some of whom were never charged, and some of whom may never be identified.
And we should be clear, the existence of uncharged or unidentified suspects doesn't necessarily imply a deliberate cover-up. It can also reflect investigatory limitations, lack of admissible evidence, witnesses who are frightened or unreliable, and forensic science that was less advanced than it is today. But we can't ignore the allegations that some individuals with social influence feared exposure, and that fear affected people's willingness to speak.
That brings us to the term that the public adopted, the family. It's evocative, almost a shorthand for a network of men with connections, perhaps sexual, perhaps social or professional, who were implicated by witnesses and rumours. Marcus, how do we talk about the family responsibly?
Carefully. The family began as a label, an expression of the idea that the crimes weren't simply isolated acts, but might be the product of a connected set of people. Over time, the label accumulated meaning. Allegations of parties where young men were abused, suggestions that some participants were from higher echelons of society, and claims that powerful people might have had a hand in protecting perpetrators. But labels can obscure as much as they reveal. So we have to distinguish three categories. First, documented and public statements, reported witness accounts, police files, and trial evidence. Second, credible but unproven allegations, statements that have some corroborating detail but have never produced prosecutions. Third, pure speculation or rumor, which can spread rapidly and harm people without contributing to the search for truth. A responsible analysis keeps those categories separate.
By the way, many listeners will have heard specific names floated in media and conversation. We're not going to repeat or amplify unproven accusations tonight. Instead, we'll talk about the dynamics that allow such networks, if they existed, to remain concealed and why witnesses might fear coming forward.
Exactly. And for the record, the question of whether there was a broad conspiracy involving prominent people remains unresolved in the public record. Some witnesses and investigators have said they believed it. Others have cautioned that the evidence is not sufficient to make that claim in court. That doesn't mean the concerns should be dismissed, just that they should be handled with rigorous standards of proof.
Let's go inside the investigation now. What police did well and where they stumbled. Marcus?
At first, the disappearances were treated as individual missing person cases. That was typical for the time. As patterns became apparent, investigators formed dedicated teams and followed leads, and there were significant forensic efforts. The eventual detection and conviction of von Einem show that persistence and some forensic breakthroughs can work. But there were also persistent criticisms that early missing persons reports were not taken with sufficient urgency, that opportunities to preserve evidence were missed, and that cultural biases, particularly regarding sexuality and youth, created investigative blind spots. Coordination across different incidents and agencies was not as smooth as it might have been, and some key leads were not pursued vigorously enough, according to some reviewers and family members.
There were also task forces and reviews later on, right? People trying to pull the threads together.
Yes. Over the years, there have been inquests, parliamentary inquiries, and cold case reviews that tried to take stock of what had been done and what remained to be done. These reviews sometimes recommended new lines of inquiry or better information sharing protocols. But institutional change can be slow, and many families felt that these efforts didn't fully address their concerns, particularly around why some potential accomplices were never charged and why certain investigative choices were made early on.
Understood. One of the hardest parts of this story is the people who saw things, who tried to tell police or reporters, and who either weren't believed, recanted, or were too frightened to speak. Marcus, tell me about witnesses and whistleblowers in this case, and what their testimonies mean to the public record.
Witnesses and informants are vital in cases that involve networks. Over the years, a number of people came forward with accounts, some describing parties or group assaults, others giving information about particular individuals' movements. Some of these accounts showed internal inconsistencies, as often happens when people recount traumatic events under pressure. Others included specific details that aligned with known facts and were therefore treated as more credible. Some of these accounts showed internal inconsistencies, as often happens when people recount traumatic events under pressure. Others included specific details that aligned with known facts and were therefore treated as more credible. Important point. Trauma affects memory. People who have experienced or witnessed abuse may recall events in fragments, or their accounts may shift as they try to put pieces together. Add to that fear, fear of retribution, fear of social ostracism, and you get why some witnesses were reluctant. There were also people who later withdrew statements, sometimes claiming coercion or regret. That complicates prosecutions.
And beyond fear, there were social costs. Some witnesses worried about career ramifications or about being named in the press. Others worried that police wouldn't protect them. For families, that must have felt like betrayal after betrayal.
Yes, and the contradictory nature of some testimonies has often been seized upon by commentators to dismiss broader allegations. But we mustn't conflate inconsistency with falsehood. Human recollection is messy. The presence of conflicting statements doesn't automatically invalidate a broader pattern, but it does make the job of proving that pattern in court more difficult.
Let's step back and outline the main theories people still discuss about these murders. I'll run through them one by one, and Marcus, I want you to comment on the evidence for each. Theory 1. Von Einem was the primary offender. He committed multiple of the murders, perhaps with help on occasion, but was essentially the core perpetrator. What do you make of that?
That's a widely held view among parts of the public and some investigators. There is some corroborating evidence, similar methods, connections between victims and von Einem, and the fact of his conviction. But the evidence tying him conclusively to every other killing is circumstantial in many instances. Courts require proof beyond reasonable doubt for each charge. Public suspicion doesn't meet that standard. So while von Einem may well have been responsible for multiple crimes, the leap from convicted of one to guilty of all remains, strictly speaking, unproven.
Theory 2. A larger, organised ring, what people call the family, in which von Einem was one participant among several, possibly including men of social influence who protected members. Marcus?
This is the version that gives the case its most unsettling implications. Witness statements and some investigative threads suggest group activity, assaults at parties, people trafficking young men, and a network that could operate with impunity. The problem is evidentiary. Firm, admissible proof tying named individuals together in criminal conduct has been elusive. There's also the risk of confirmation bias in long-running cases, where people begin to fit disparate facts into a single narrative. Nonetheless, when you see repeated reports pointing to organized group behavior, you have to take them seriously and investigate with rigor.
Theory 3. Institutional failure or cover-up. Police, politicians, or other officials actively suppressing evidence or obstructing investigations to protect the powerful. What's the evidence there?
This is the most consequential theory, because if true, it would mean that justice was actively prevented rather than simply hampered by human error. There are alleged instances of slow or inadequate responses, of records that were reportedly mishandled, and of individuals who later claimed they couldn't get cooperation. Proving deliberate obstruction is very difficult, requires documentary trails, whistleblower corroboration, or records showing intentional action. Some inquiries have recommended further scrutiny in specific areas, but again, the public record doesn't contain a full, incontrovertible accounting that proves systematic cover-up. That said, the perception of institutional failure is itself damaging and worthy of inquiry.
Right. Theory 4. Connections to other unsolved crimes, either in South Australia or elsewhere. Any merit to that?
There are similarities between certain unsolved cases, victim profile, methods, disposal locations, that invite comparison. Cross-jurisdictional linkages are not uncommon in serial offending. Forensic science has advanced a great deal since the 1980s, and cold case teams routinely look for connections using DNA and other methods. In some instances globally, DNA links have resolved decades-old mysteries. For this case, DNA and material evidence have been re-examined at various points, but identifying cross-case connections is contingent on comparing physical evidence that may not exist or may have degraded.
So, the big picture is this. There are plausible, evidence-based theories, and then there are more speculative ones. And part of our responsibility is to say explicitly where the evidence ends.
Exactly. The presence of plausible explanation doesn't equal proof, and the absence of proof does not mean we should ignore plausible leads, especially where victims and communities remain entitled to answers.
Let's talk about impact. How did the family murders change Adelaide and the way Australia approaches these kinds of cases?
At the community level, the murders inflicted a deep sense of unease. A city that thought of itself as safe had to reckon with persistent, sexually motivated violence involving vulnerable young men. That shifted conversations about public safety, outreach to at-risk youth, and the need for better support systems. At the institutional level, cases like this contributed to reforms in how missing persons investigations are prioritized, how forensic evidence is handled, and how task forces are structured across incidents. There was also an increased sensitivity, slow to develop but visible nonetheless, to the vulnerabilities of marginalized groups and to the need for anonymous or protected reporting mechanisms for witnesses afraid to speak.
And yet, the feeling of mistrust lasts. Families I spoke to told me they still wanted a fuller account, an acknowledgement of mistakes, and, where possible, answers about who else may have been involved.
Yes. Public inquiries and reviews can produce recommendations, but they can't always give victims what they most want: clear, named accountability. That's a painful reality.
We should pause and reflect on the ethics of retelling this story. Podcasts, books, and TV shows can reopen wounds. Marcus, how do you think investigators, journalists, and advocates should approach these stories ethically?
With humility and with a victim-centered focus. That means prioritizing the dignity and privacy of families, not amplifying unverified allegations, and being clear about the limits of what is known. It also means using public attention constructively to press for re-examination of evidence when warranted, to support survivors and relatives, and to encourage institutions to implement lessons learned.
Sometimes people say, are we doing harm by repeating these stories? My answer is, it depends on how we tell them. If we are accusatory without proof, or if we treat the victims as scenery for shock value, that's harm. If we are meticulous, cite sources, and make the purpose accountability and remembrance, then revisiting a case can be a form of public service. Before we close, Marcus, are there realistic pathways to new answers in a case like this, decades on?
Realistic pathways exist, but they're narrow. One is technological. DNA and other forensic techniques have solved many cold cases. If preserved evidence exists that can be retested, that offers a concrete route to new leads. Another is witness re-engagement, offering protections, anonymity, or new incentives for those who have previously stayed silent. Third is institutional will, a fully resourced, independent cold case review that can subpoena records, test evidence, and challenge prior assumptions. None of these are guaranteed, and each requires political and social appetite to pursue them. None of these are guaranteed, and each requires political and social appetite to pursue them.
And what about social appetite? Do you think the public still cares enough to push for that?
There are always competing priorities. But cases that involve structural questions, potential complicity of powerful people, systemic failures, vulnerabilities of marginalized groups, tend to resurface periodically because they touch on larger anxieties about justice. So, if a compelling legal or forensic lead appears, or if families mount a credible campaign for review, public interest can be sustained.
I want to bring this home. Names matter. We have spoken in general terms, but there are families who still carry grief, who have campaigned for answers, and who have sought recognition. If listeners take anything from this episode, let it be two things. These were people with lives and loved ones, and the status of a case as cold shouldn't be accepted as final if there are credible leads left to pursue.
And I'll add, for investigators and policymakers, the lessons are about vigilance, about listening to vulnerable communities, about investing in forensic and interview resources, and about creating environments where witnesses can come forward without fearing ruin. Without those systems, patterns of abuse can persist.
We will include links in the episode notes to reputable sources for those who want to read court documents, official reviews, and reporting from credible outlets. If you are a family member who didn't want to be contacted, or if this episode causes distress, please know the intent here is not to reopen trauma for its own sake, but to press for clarity and dignity. If you are a family member who didn't want to be contacted, or if this episode causes distress, please know the intent here is not to reopen trauma for its own sake, but to press for clarity and dignity. So, where does that leave us? The family murders remain a tangle of answered and unanswered questions. We have one conviction that proved at least one person was responsible for at least one of these killings. We have patterns that suggest more than lone, isolated acts. We have witnesses with painful, sometimes inconsistent stories. And we have institutions that, by their own later reviews, could have done some things differently. And then there are the gaps. Potential accomplices never charged, allegations never tested in court, and a public record that feels incomplete.
Which is precisely why the case remains still unanswered. The passage of time makes resolution harder in some technical senses, but it also sharpens the moral question. Do we accept an incomplete record when so many tell us they were harmed?
Right. Before we end, Marcus, one final, slightly personal question. After studying cases like this for years, do you ever feel hope that justice can arrive, even decades later?
Yes, it's a guarded hope. I've watched technology and persistence produce breakthroughs, DNA linking offenders to crimes decades later, witnesses deciding to speak, institutional reviews reopening matters with fresh energy. So while the odds against complete closure can be high, I believe the right combination of forensic advances, careful re-examination, and public will can produce answers. And sometimes even a formal acknowledgement of mistakes can be a form of justice for families.
Thank you, Marcus. And thank you, listeners. We will end as we began, with a moment of silence for the men and boys whose lives were taken, and for the families who still seek answers. If you found this episode difficult, that's understandable. We provide links to support services in the show notes. This is still Unanswered. I'm Claire Hewson. The questions here aren't comfortable, but they matter. They deserve the scrutiny of our institutions, the care of our communities, and the memory of those who cannot speak for themselves anymore.